usually I think that means I'll say something genuine and not something I can't. So I think what I'll start with is Joki's dad reminded me that I spent either Thanksgiving or Christmas. I don't know what it is.
Christmas.
This is Christmas. And I'm sure I also had Christmas with my family. But which is saying, like, since we go to the store, now I get to have anything. And maybe because of family and all this kind of stuff. And we had Passover with Jim. So yeah, that's been one of the neat things about this experience is kind of watching this family grow. So that spirit is really special for us. Welcome all of our family members to be on this side of the table. So now I'll introduce Kathy back to family, her son Eli, who has also been a boat talk here, also introduced talks. Part of it I introduced Eli like a month ago for another talk, so I didn't want to make sure everything I said that time. That was Michael Dowdy, I think I was got some help even with that. So all of a sudden, it feels like very familiar when we get going. So in that spirit, I will turn it over to Eli, who will have some words. Thank you, Eli. Thank you for being here. Thank you guys for being here.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Ben, for that lovely introduction. Thanks so much for being here. It's a real honor and joy to introduce my mother, Katherine Jelly, and of course to celebrate the release of her book, Layers of Learning, Lessons from a Life in Education. So Katherine, just feels odd to you that way. That's how I'm going to do it. Earned her BA from Yale University, where she was among the first class of women to graduate from Yale College in 1971. Is that correct? She then went on to complete MAT at Harvard and an EdD, a doctorate in education, at Boston University. Beginning in the 1970s, she worked as a teacher in various public school contexts, most notably perhaps for the longest tenure at Somerville High School in Somerville, Massachusetts, where she taught for 5 years. A very kind of different moment, I think, in Somerville's history. After finishing her doctorate in 1985, she took up a position at Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, where she mentored individual students and also led group inquiries in subjects such as the philosophy of education and the art of teaching. Katherine spent about a decade at Goddard, is that about right? Before she moved to Vermont College, where she led a low residency program for adults in pursuit of their BA in teaching certifications, and where she later directed and also sort of founded, designed, along with several others, the Master of Education program, MED program at Vermont College. One final career turn led her to Empire State College of the State University of New York, a kind of non-traditional college for adult learners within the SUNY system, where she directed the Center for Mentoring and Learning, leading faculty development and other things. Katherine is the editor, along with Alan Mandel, one of her colleagues at Empire State, of Principles, Practices, and Creative Tensions in Progressive Education, which was published by Sense Publishers in 2017. And she is the sole author, of course, of the urgent and beautifully written book we are here to applaud and engage this evening, Layers of Learning, Lessons from a Life in Education, which was published just this past December by Brill. So I guess a quick word about format. Kathy will speak about the book for a few minutes and maybe read a couple of passages from it. Then I'll ask just maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll kind of turn it over to the audience. That's it.
doing this, for reading a book. I really appreciate it. And Ben, you can't hear me, but thank you for all your support along the way. And thank you all for coming, I really appreciate it. So as Eli mentioned, I'll just say, oh, hi, I haven't seen you. Do you want to come up, or is it comfortable? Wherever you want to be.
Or just sit here.
Oh, Rebecca, I didn't see you. Hi. Goodness, I think everybody else, and Buddy, I didn't see you. So, okay, we started then, but anyway, here we all are, having a wonderful time, I hope. As Eli mentioned, I'll just say a few words at first, and in fact, I might just barrel down so as to not take too much time, but I wanna give you a sense of the whole. And then I'll read a few passages from the book. Basically what I want to try to do is to highlight my main purposes and my emphases in the book, as well as my method, if you will, in this book. So just to give you a bare bones introduction to what I was trying to do in the book. My overarching question was to get at not just how we can try to talk louder. Okay, yeah. To me, it feels like I'm yelling.
You're not.
Okay, I'm gonna yell at
Yes.
you.
That's
That's
better,
better,
yes,
that's better.
Yeah.
In this book, I really wanted, after decades in the field of education, I wanted to face my own questions and the various contradictions, conundra that I came up against in my career. On the one hand, teaching is simple. On the other hand, it's highly complex. On the one hand, here's what we need to do. On the other hand, can we do it? And so forth. So, what I tried to do through the book is to bring together my experience in teaching, and that spans from high school teaching to undergraduate to graduate, and to look at, from all of those experiences, to take from them what I could glean about not just how we could change public education for the better, but I gradually came to see that the question needed to be if we could we change education for the better? So to get at these questions, I do trace my journey through my studies and my stories, and I really try to bring them into conversation with one another through the book, using each to inform and to interrogate the other. So it's a back and forth kind of book. And what I do through that, and in the latter part of the book, is I attempt to derive what I view to be abiding ideas that last through fad and fashion. And these are ideas about teaching and learning that I would argue can apply at almost any age, in almost any context. And I did teach in private schools, public schools, and supervised students in elementary schools. I even was a parent administrator in a preschool. And as I tried to hold my feet to the fire, I always looked at all my contexts and tried to think about what pertained throughout that mattered. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is I trace my journey, and the book is actually, in that sense, chronological. So, and that effort was, as I said, first to derive what I view to be abiding ideas, and second, to propose changes that I think are doable. That's what I wanted to get at, what's doable to improve education, public education in America. And so to do that, I also propose changes to teacher education and changes to schools' relationships to their communities, as well as to broader efforts at social change. So it was a wallop, and it's hard to wrap words around the book for this evening's purposes, but I'll just say that three emphases recur in what I was writing and thinking. One is I argue for the importance of teaching and learning for real, and I say real, in italics, boldface, underline, because so much of education does not get at that. It does not necessarily get at the honest questions, at kids' own actual questions, in terms of research, at what we could look to do to improve education. I'll read a passage about that later. A second emphasis that might seem surprising, what I've said so far, but to me, ideas matter. And I argue in this book for the importance of ideas to what we're doing, to how we think about it. And I talk in particular about two sets of ideas, two concepts. One is significance, and I talk about significance in its many facets, and as it is both an end and a means in education. I talk, the second set of concepts, I guess I should say, is I look at dialectical relations in education, and by that I don't mean some fancy Marxist term necessarily. I mean more the ongoing mutual impact and of ideas as I'm stumbling on. I'll say, for example, between the autonomous development of the self or the social development of the self, or between the individual and the community within a classroom, within a society, or between school and society itself. I argue that each creates the other in all of these pairs, which I refuse to call binaries, because they really are mutually informative. And third, I place strong emphasis, in fact, the book, I hope, is an example of the parlance in the education world is critical reflection. And by critical reflection, what I'm referring to is really the ongoing examination and evaluation of one's experience, what one reads, what one sees, how one lives, the context within which we try to do the work we do. I'm talking about critical reflection as the ongoing interaction between ideas and experience. So I'll just mention two more things. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Within these emphases, I will mention that I pay particular attention to community as I see its importance, and you all do, I won't recite it, but its importance in our society, its importance in schools. And I talk about it as both an end that we seek and as a means that we use within a classroom, for example, to help students feel that they belong, to help students take risks, to ask their own questions. So I view community as just like significance, an end and a means. And lastly, I'll say that what pervaded my career, I began with this goal, I ended with this goal, was to support the critical awareness in our students, in the public, in our teachers, in current practicing educators. And so in every context, whether I was working with students, trying to help them to question all that they saw, as well as themselves, by the way. I also, in teacher education, which I view as essentially devolved in many cases into a kind of technical training, which is not what we need. What we need is the aesthetic, critical, intellectual dimensions of what this profession really entails. And so I'm talking about teaching toward criticality. And I'm talking about that even among practicing educators, administrators, teachers. They need to be looking at what they're doing, why they're doing it, and why they're doing it the way they're doing it, and toward what ends. It's only through that you can actually carve a path that isn't just reproductive. So, then I guess I'll be really quick about this. I think I talked too long. I'll just say that the second half of the book, well, it's more like the second third, excuse me, part 2 of the book, which is about the last third of the book, is where I do carve out what I view to be these essential elements of teaching and learning that are significant, that that actually make a difference to the learner and to our society. And I show the importance of rigorous teacher education, and actually make the argument that amidst all the policy, the politics, the bureaucracy, that teachers make the greatest difference. And so the most effective, most doable avenue to changing schools, I would argue, is to changing teacher education. Not to say we don't need to make all of these other efforts, but it's an argument I make in terms of doability and broader impact. And then lastly, I'll just mention, in the final chapter, I return to these dialectical relationships that I mentioned earlier. And I'll say that the relationship between schools and their communities and broader efforts at social change is absolutely key. So many people have wasted a lot of time arguing about the chicken or the egg, which comes first. Do we have to fix society before we can fix schools? Do we have to fix schools before we can fix society? Well, both, they need each other if they're actually going to grow and improve. It's the same in all those relationships I talked about. And so I propose some, without going into it, it's beyond the scope of this book, but I propose some of the avenues into those efforts. And I also would argue that understanding the relationships is part of what helps us to find the avenues and therefore be more effective. I guess that's all I'd say. Did I go on much too long?
Oh, that's great.
You could be my timekeeper. You could go
Oh.
tweet.
No, that's good.
So, having said that, I guess I need to pull out the book. I have to tell you, it was quite the exercise picking something to read, because the first stab at it was half an hour, might be very much. The second stab was 20 minutes. The third stab, I think I got it down to 3 passages. And they don't do it justice in terms of the arguments of the book, but they'll give you the points.
Hold the book up.
Oh, one second.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I saw
Oh,
that.
I'm so glad you asked me to do that, Tom, because the painting on the book is by Jean Lamasto, who's.
Oh, really?
Jean,
Yeah.
stand up and take a bow.
Oh, wow.
So I'm honored that she asked me to.
Yeah, you agree. I love Jean's work, and though you couldn't see it necessarily, there are layers in this painting. Actually, in the one dimension, one above another, but also, as Jean pointed out, being a painter, of course, the layers, the depth of the layers, layer upon layer. And so that was part of why I settled on this particular painting. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
So, what I'll try to do is really just, I guess it's 4 readings, and I cut them to smithereens, but at any rate, 4 readings, one about my experience as a student that helped to shape my sense of teaching and learning for real, and one about my experience as a high school teacher, and one about my experience as a teacher educator. So, with that said, I'll just dive in. And this is in the introduction. I'm talking about inquiry that matters. And I say, so much of education, both in practice and in policy, is buried under the weight of its own window dressing. In practice, so often teachers are asked to deliver prepackaged, apparently sophisticated curricula, to employ externally developed, pre-designed methods, all possibly showcasing teachers' knowledge and skill, but responding little to students' real needs and questions and interests. And in policymaking forums where sounding knowledgeable. And in policymaking forums where sounding knowledgeable and or focusing solely on that which is measurable are the currencies of choice, all too often it's the erudite sounding but utterly unimportant questions and ultimately ineffectual solutions that prevail. But teaching and learning that have significant positive impact must be teaching and learning for real. So So, let's see. A story from my days, I'm trying to speak loudly. A story from my days as a college student. As a student in college for a course on colonial American history, tasked with writing a paper drawing solely on primary sources, I chose to learn about the lives of women in Puritan society. Specifically, through reading women's diaries and letters, I hoped to learn how, in such a strict, repressed society, women experience love, marriage, and family. Although a challenging question to get at through primary sources, which were stamped and repressed themselves, my research fascinated me. I loved trying to investigate this question, which for me was very real. In the discipline of history, we can count the cows on the common in the colonial village in Massachusetts. We can look at the government and politics of that society. We can read about the religion and the ideas that inform the culture. And all of those dimensions shed light on a given time, a particular place. But I wanted to explore what it was like to live, as to be a woman in that society. Was it possible to plumb that, to get into that internal feeling world as well? My graduate teaching assistant for the course, however, saw this question differently. With little comment and without a grade, he returned the paper to me, saying this topic was not appropriate and this paper was not history. I, always the dutiful good student, was mortified, yet gradually my anger was aroused as well. I decided to ask the professor of the course, a renowned scholar in colonial history, for his view. He read and returned the paper to me, not merely disagreeing with his teaching assistant, but going further to say that he thought the paper was strong, indicative of worthy research, and interestingly enough, he added that he had published an essay on a closely related topic. From this incident, which was critical to my development both as a student and an educator, I learned many lessons. First, and regrettably, I learned that real questions, that is, questions to which one does not already have an answer, about which one is genuinely interested in, about which one is genuinely interested, and which, though they may not fit tidily into a given discipline, may hold personal or social significance. These are not always the questions looked upon with favor in academia. So often it is narrow lenses and confining boxes that determine appropriateness to the discipline. And these boxes can be differently defined. What is deemed unsuitable by one may be considered fitting and illuminating by another. But in experiencing these arbitrarily and idiosyncratically defined boundaries around both what is appropriate academic inquiry and what a given discipline encompasses, I also, though I couldn't have put it into words then, I learned that in some small way that belief in oneself, trusting one's questions, would be needed when stepping outside the expected to get to the real. My learning in that regard, however, remained partial, not yet conscious, not yet articulated. It took many other such incidents for me to begin to see what I was learning. I'll skip a second story where I also tried to look at conscientious objection in America during the Vietnam War, and my advisor said, well, it's interesting, it's thoughtful, but it's not. So again, it's not history. So I had to go back to the drawing board again. I protested, and I was, what's the word, vindicated. Anyway, but I'll do another. This time I moved to just my an opening exercise I did as an undergraduate, as a high school teacher. My focus in these opening days of school was learning about who my students were. And I should tell you, I had intentionally chosen a very dense, working class city. Most of my students were disaffected, alienated. I purposefully chose an attract school to work with the non-college oriented students. Those were the kids I really wanted to work with. So, on the opening days of school, my focus was learning about who my students were. In the areas of concern list that I used, naming 20 topics, inviting more, and asking students to write a question that they had about each of these topics allowed me to begin to learn my students' interests and concerns as it helped us to shape our curriculum together. If I didn't already mention, I was an English teacher. And it gave me a way to suggest to my students that we would be doing this together, that their interests and input would contribute directly to the focus of our work, and asking them to leave their name off if they preferred, and to put down their actual as opposed to expected questions gave them the space I hoped to be real. This starting point proved so helpful, both to coming to know them and to our sharing in the course's curriculum design, that I used it every year with every class as I relayed back to each class some of what their group had recorded, talked with them about ways we might get at some of these questions shared by many, and provided as well for students' individual exploration. We returned to these areas of concern through the year for easy reference, for addition, for reminders of our purposes. I'll skip other things about that and get to, have I gone on too long yet?
No.
This is later, a few years later in school. I've outlined in the book, I've framed some of my main purposes as an educator. I've talked about helping students to come to know themselves, to come to accept and understand others. I've talked about issues related to giving them more of a sense that they counted on this earth. As I mentioned to you, I was working with many students who did not feel that they counted, certainly not in school. So, and I guess I should mention that in addition, I was working not just toward autonomous thought, but also toward developing their ethical sensibilities, which to me is very strongly correlated with autonomous thought. So one afternoon at the end of a long, hard day at school, I walked out of the building to find a swastika carved into the door of my car.
Yeah.
The paint scraped off, the image clear. It saddened and discouraged me. Was it a random, ignorant act of vandalism? Was it actually a somewhat aware of something, hateful expression of anti-Semitism? Was it done by one of my students, aimed at me personally? I never knew. But that question stayed with me. I knew my students, I knew their context, and while I might make different and or additional meanings of it now, for me then, that act was emblematic of these students needing to make a mark. It said much to me of their need to be recognized, to count, to matter. Carving out that swastika, at least according to the meaning I made of this incident, was their way, however small, however hurtful, of trying to, I was going to say however inchoate, but how do you pronounce inchoate? Inchoate? Inchoate.
I never know.
Whatever, that. Of trying to have some small impact, some small voice in the world. It was also, it seemed to me, in its hatefulness, a demonstration of that student's deeply diminished sense of his or her own worth, of what happens when one does not feel valued, when one does not value oneself. Out of hurt comes hurt. I hurt, and I will hurt you. And in relation to the need for status in the pecking order of this community, which was made up of Haitians, Greeks, Puerto Ricans, oh my goodness, it was a panoply of Portuguese. It was just a rich diversity in the school. But in the pecking order of this community, that student may have been trying to say, I may be a loser, but I'm better than you. This incident became for me a central informing image as it crystallized my deepening sense of the profound effects of my students' lack of positive sense of self. And as I framed and later tried to investigate my question about what I perceived to be a relationship between what I then called self-esteem, which I would now say is a co-opted, trivialized term, but nonetheless, it's the one I was using then, and moral conduct. What was the relationship between these two that was pushing me? Was it the case that these students lashed out because they felt they didn't count? Did they need to make that mark because no one heard them? Did they carve that symbol to somehow, in the vicious cycle of putting down the other, to feel above someone else on the ladder of status as they perceived it? I had long placed emphasis on my students' ethical sensibilities, on their moral as well as intellectual development. I had long given attention to their sense of themselves. I'm sorry, I already told you that's all it is. To both their self-awareness and their self-esteem in our work together. Throughout my teaching, incorporating attention to these areas in all that we did, I had acted on the belief that my students' well-being, their sense of self and other, and their character mattered every bit as much as their academic knowledge and skill. But somehow this incident coalesced for me the connection between and among these important realms. It seemed to me that if my students felt who they were, what they said, or what they did mattered, if their identity and potential were more positively conceived, their voice and their actions might be more constructively directed. I began to think that there was indeed a very strong relationship between sense of self and ethical action. And actually I read that paragraph, that passage, to try to convey part of that dance that I'm talking about between studies and stories. And that story really led me to years of study into the consciousness of self, into dialectics, meaning, and all of that. But I'll skip all of that. I won't tell you as much. I'll move just to a story when I was a teacher educator. So those were stories from my high school teaching, and in my college teaching. I'll just jump right to the teacher education story, if I can find it quickly. So, first I'll read a quote from Willie Mears, who was one of my heroes throughout my career in education. Teaching is a voluntary, intelligent, collective activity that occurs in contexts that are often coercive, ignorant, and individualizing. Good teachers are too often turned into turkeys because they work, for the most part, on turkey farms. For me, a story about Carrie, one of my students in the Vermont College Master of Education program, and Joan, her cooperating teacher, not their real names, of course, stands out. The first day that I went to observe and meet with them in Joan's 4th grade classroom, I was struck by this space, bursting with a rich panoply of inviting materials, waiting for students' use and exploration. With shelf after shelf of resources to draw on, with cozy, comfortable places for reading and working, with students' creations everywhere. Did I say this is an elementary classroom? It is. Enlivening the environment. This classroom was stimulating, attractive, alive. I had encountered Joan, an experienced elementary educator in a nearby town, before. I knew her to be highly intelligent, skilled, caring, aware. And having worked with Carrie on several of her graduate studies, I knew her too to be intelligent, creative, and genuinely thoughtful about her teaching. I was looking forward to this internship. I'm going to skip a bunch here just to get to one piece. When 1 week after we had our initial conversations, I returned to the school, I was the supervisor in this triangle. This time to observe Carrie teaching math. I was shocked. Here was this sharp, imaginative, eager intern delivering a prepackaged curriculum called Everyday Math, making her way through a script not of her own creation, toward ends, she later explained, not of her design, nor even of her cooperating teacher Jones. As she moved through this everyday math lesson, slowly getting to the piece she believed to be more engaging and more valuable within it, gradually she seemed to enter more fully into the process. Yet still, I found her strangely removed, as were the children. Nor it was clear it was this simply performance anxiety while being observed. There was an almost surreal quality to it all. Clearly dissatisfied with what had just occurred, as we met afterwards to analyze, evaluate, and reflect on the class, Carrie characterized this segment, the first segment of the preceding hour, as a disaster. Going on to look at the full picture, she found a few redeeming moments. with students more engaged as the class continued. Yet, examining together what had transpired, we each saw the damaging effects on both her and the children of carrying out a plan not of one's design toward goals not of one's own choosing. A kind of disembodied play took place with, excuse me, it's a good thing I'm almost finished reading, with, it appeared, few connections being made between teacher and student, student and student, student and subject matter. Certainly it appeared from my perspective, few synapses were firing. How utterly wasteful of these students' time and potential, of this educator's intelligence and energy. I was gonna read more, but I do think now I've gone on plenty long, so I'm sorry about that if it was too long.
That's great.
And so,
All right.
Eli is my, how do you pronounce this, interlocutor,
Yes.
right?
Although I had 3 questions I was going to pose, but I think I might actually just begin with one, and then see if the audience has any contributions, and then perhaps I can come back to the other 2. Does that sound cool?
Yeah, I think, it's not because I went on.
No. It's just like, I think that feels like a good rhythm. So this maybe speaks a little bit to the last story that you read from your time at Vermont College. So one moment that I appreciate in the book is when you talk about the founding of this MED program at Vermont College, and how you and the other architects of the program worked together to kind of conceive of its philosophic basis and also the culture and the curriculum that would emerge from that. So you reflect here that you and each of your colleagues, when thinking about the most formative experience of your own kind of path in education, all of you cited courses in counseling as especially crucial to your development as teachers or as teacher educators. So yeah, I'd love to hear you say a bit more about that. So what did the discipline or practices of counseling or therapy perhaps have to teach us about teaching?
Thank you for that question. It's a whopper in terms of all the things I could point to, but I'll just say, by the way, that this was one of the no, that's not the right word. One of the best experiences one can have in a career such as this. Actually, Eli, could you grab me a water? Thanks a lot. We came from different subject areas, different age groups that we taught, but there were 4 of us coming together to create what we envisioned as truly, what I was saying, we had the privilege of designing from scratch a program that we believed could be helpful to teachers. And so, coming from all these different backgrounds, it was really striking to me, and I did write about this, which is what I was referring to in the book, that I was leading the group, and when I posed to them the question of what was the single most important or I hate the adjective impactful, but impactful study. Thanks so much. Excuse me. Study that they engaged in and becoming educators themselves. And interestingly enough, all 4 of us pointed to counseling courses in our training, which are not required in most teacher education programs. And so we really tried to plumb that. We tried to get at, well, what was it about those courses that mattered to us and made such a difference to who we became? And first and foremost, an overarching response would be that in those courses we learned to listen. It's that simple. And I've always felt that teaching as listening is more important than teaching as telling. And so we, first of all, tried to probe just what that meant, how we could listen to our students, what were the forms, for example, the areas of concern questionnaire, or just in conversation, or a million other ors of how to be with the student. And in those courses, in which we each emphasize different things. One person was talking about humanistic psychology and talking about the importance of the whole person, and he brought that to his understanding of what it meant to teach. And another person talked about reading Buber and encounter with the other, Martin Buber I'm referring to, encountering the other as not an it, but as a you, as a thou. That person is an end in him or herself, not a vehicle to be filled or a problem to be fixed. Let's see, what were other emphases? So there were existential psychology. One person said that within their counseling class, they had encountered, first of all, the concept of ambivalence, which this teacher in my MAT program argued was supremely important in knowing oneself, in teaching, and helping students, but also the idea of choice and honoring the person, and the choices that person is making. And I may not be hitting the highlights of it, but we just all came at it with an awareness that teaching was much more than telling, teaching was much more than academics, teaching was about relationship, even, I would argue, in a lecture course, to varying degrees, in varying ways. One can treat the other as an end and not a means.
Yeah, thank you, that's perfect. Yeah, does anyone, have any questions? Yes.
The counseling courses, were they courses that were being taught, for example, in a counseling psychology department or something like that, or are you talking about ed psych?
No, thanks for asking me to clarify that. These were courses in teacher education programs, not in psychology programs. But the faculty, I can't speak for the other folks, I'll just say the person who led my counseling course also taught in other programs. I believe, like there was a counseling program and something else.
But the teacher education students all took a counseling course back then.
No, not in the program, in my MAT program, where I was a student, no, I elected to do that.
I see, okay.
As did the other three on our team, our
Isn't that
design
interesting?
team.
Yeah.
Yeah, we elected to do it. But I will say that in the design of the MED program that we did design, we made it what we call the core seminar, because we argued that all educators ought to have a course in counseling.
It's nice.
And maybe you could say, what's the difference between an ed psych course and what you're talking about?
Basically, it's the difference between theory and practice, in a sense. In other words, ed psych being lots of theories of development, theories of learning, human development I'm talking about. It could be psychosocial, cognitive, whatever. Whereas a counseling course is much more of it's theoretically based. I mean, I referred to certain theorists. Carl Rogers would be an example. They're theoretically grounded, but they are about the practice of helping another human being. And that's a dimension I forgot to mention, that counseling courses were important to us to see teaching as helping. Yeah.
Drew.
I have a question. In the beginning, you talk about how academia, the world of academics or teaching, has boxes that you want to check off and what you deem is appropriate and inappropriate. Even an example that you mentioned with the paper that you written. Can you give an example or describe a moment of something you thought was inappropriate when it comes to teaching or pedagogy and education that you now think, oh, this is totally appropriate?
Good question.
Except, I have to parse it a little bit,
Okay.
because you're suggesting that I thought something was inappropriate,
And maybe you
but
did.
now I would think it was appropriate.
Right, so that can be part of your answer, like, oh, like, maybe you didn't think it was inappropriate. But if there was, like, is there a moment you're like, oh, like my thought process or feeling on this has changed as I've gone deeper into being a teacher, into education?
Well, I
so
would
some-
say that, yeah, when I was, a high school student, for sure, I really, you know, I thought everything was in these boxes, and I prided myself on being very organized about the boxes, you know, that I was gonna fill. And I think it was through higher education that I began to question the boxes. And, I don't think I'm getting any question though. I think it's because I haven't changed my mind on it. It started so early. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
You sure? Push me.
I mean, I guess it's a question that it is that you need to think about, because then you have to go in the recesses of your mind and like identify those moments within your life, those decades of like, oh, what did I purely think about this? And it would take, it's more of a like something that I guess a question that would give you or take away to think about. But I respect and receive that answer, because if nothing comes to mind, then that leads me to like, oh, there hasn't been major changes in your approach or your thinking or critical thinking or
Well, I
what's
could say there were
important, what's appropriate.
changes. It was the last part where you added that I would have, let me answer a different way. When I served on a board that was looking at, grant proposals for research. And people, I mentioned earlier about the currency of things that are measurable. And I had spent a lot of time in a world where things that were measurable, were the currencies of choice, you know, that, and I, finally, and I had early on in my career bought that to some extent, but on this board, I finally spoke up, even though there was a resounding silence after I said this. I spoke up saying that these questions were not important. What we needed to look for were the questions that were, or something. I'm still not getting the question. I'm really not.
It's okay.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay.
Any other? Yeah.
What I want to say is half question, half comment. And, and I would, say that, you talk primarily about teaching in a school context, but it occurs in many other important places, such as in a church. And I found listening to you, and well, I know in my own experience that as I gradually learned to teach and well, at the point that I was teaching undergraduates, that had its effect both on my teaching at a more advanced level and and for my teaching role in churches. And so that what you have to say has considerable value outside of the ordinary place that you've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. I think it's true, just as I think that many of the ideas that I say are abiding in teaching and learning. For example, starting with the student's purposes, or problem-focused education that crosses disciplinary boundaries, or inquiry that relates to the whole person. Yeah, I think that goes beyond the walls of schools too. So yeah, thanks for that comment. Yeah.
A couple of comments and then two questions, one of which I'm going to discard. It was interesting getting the announcement about the book and the reading tonight, because I didn't know that about you. So this has opened the door into seeing who you are, which was very interesting, and that's one reason I'm here. And just to mention, my parents were educators in Georgia, from very deep rural Georgia to Atlanta, so I'm sure they would appreciate your insights, although they're not around, so they can't read it. My first question that I'm not going to ask is, what's wrong with education? Because I don't know. I'm removed from it, and I read things and hear things. There's something wrong, and it needs to be corrected. So I don't really want you to address that, but my question is, who is your audience in writing the book? And I look at it a couple of ways, and you can go anywhere you want with that, but how much of it was written basically to record your own thoughts for yourself or for your family or for people you know, and how much of it is reaching out to those that are educators that themselves might also be looking for answers or the questions that need to be addressed in a professional teaching kind of environment. So if you could take that last part.
No, I really appreciate that question. First of all, because I wrestled with it mightily in terms of who was my audience. But to back it up a little bit, I'll take it in stages. When I first started to write this book, I really did want to look at the whole of it and say to myself, what do you conclude about, you've been working on education for 50 years. You've been looking at how to strengthen it, and I could go into where it needs strengthening. You've run into contradictions along the way. So I wanted to write the book for myself. I thought I would just write it and put it under my pillow. I just wanted to know what I thought. And that purpose continued through the writing. But eventually, I guess you could say, I got too big for my britches, because I began to think, no, I really want to be helping teachers to look at their role, and I do talk a lot about teachers' role in schools, what they could do to shape the environment that shapes them, that holds them back. And I talk a lot about what schools could do to shape the environment that shapes them, that holds them back. Anyway, I began to believe in some of my conclusions to the extent that I wanted people to read it. And so then the question was who, and that was the tricky part, because I wanted to bring in theory for teacher educators, for students of education, but I also very much wanted to mine my experience in relation to that theory. And I wanted for this book to appeal both to the lay audience, the person who is a parent in a community and just cares about education, or even isn't a parent and cares about the role of education in our democracy. And I wanted it to possibly be of use to teacher educators in their courses. And I also worked in schools with experienced teachers. And if I could have read more, I would have read one example from that work. And so I wanted it to be for practicing experienced educators, in a sense, to give them hope, to give them ideas, and to give them encouragement. So it was tricky to try to talk to those audiences, but I tried to make the theory accessible and the experience worthwhile. Does that answer your question? Sorry?
Yes.
I just was glad that you talked about deep listening, the power of a teacher to listen deeply. Maybe it's a lost art. But what a gift to that child.
Thanks.
we hear so much about teachers having to teach to the test and, you know, the policies that are so numerical. Do you address how to get over that hump?
I do.
Okay.
And I forget, by the way, I might have cut myself off because I've gone on too long. If I read to you that the particular student teacher whom I saw, whom I worked with,
Yeah.
she did opt out of teaching as a career. It was too constrained. And her cooperating teacher likewise decided to retire 10 years early. She couldn't do it anymore. The environment was too dispirited. But to get back to your question, say it again.
That we hear so much about the policy that you have to teach to the test
yes.
and
Right.
all that, and how do you overcome that in the whole bureaucracy?
I spend a lot of time on that
Okay.
in the book, and I'll give you, I also try to tell stories about it. And one story I'll just share very briefly, teaching grammar in high school. I was teaching to a test that I didn't even create, my department had created it. And I'm working with students who don't care about school. They're not going on to school. And they don't care about grammar. And so, throughout the book, I'm telling stories about how one resists the messages that you're given or works, you know, close your door and eliminate all the hoo-ha that students do. And so one little story I'll say about teaching grammar is I gave my students a choice of whether or not to learn it. And I would say on the days that we designated a particular thing. Well, first off, I should back up and say that we talked about different kinds of language we use on the street, language we use to get a job, different kinds of language and its purposes, and the validity of each in its context. And so they could feel affirmed, not just like I'm a dummy, I don't get grammar, but, okay, teach me that if it's gonna help me get a job to, you know, blah, 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 blah. But I always gave them the choice. I said, those of you who don't wanna learn this particular thing, you can just read a book quietly and we'll do this activity. And it was a little bit radical, a little bit scary thing to do. But what's fascinating to me is given the choice, they all opted in. They all opted in.
That's great.
And they had a reason for opting in. So, they're
And they
just,
had a
all I'm
choice.
saying is there are workarounds, there are ways to, help. Yeah, that's enough said, I should stop. I haven't looked at my watch once.
That's great. I have other questions. I'm kind of torn though. What do you think? Should we continue this sort of dialogue, or
What do you all think?
open it up to a more informal, convivial space?
Can I ask one question that's
Yeah.
sort of just what we're talking about, I think, like, so that the person who had, your student teacher had to teach this class in math, and set whatever the object of the lesson was, I guess she didn't care about, or she didn't like the methodology that she was given. Kids need to learn how to add and subtract. So are you saying that what could have happened for that teacher is she could have figured out a different way to teach that? I mean, you just said they don't have to learn grammar. It's true, I don't think people do have to learn grammar. And maybe now people don't have to learn math anymore with our cell phones and everything, but it is nice, it's handy to know a little bit of math. You know, what do you do? How do you make it work? How do you find finding the way to teach that, anyway.
No, I appreciate the follow-up question because, first of all, to clarify something, I wasn't saying grammar didn't matter. But I was
No.
saying that you can ask students to look at the front, but you can't control what's in their minds. I was saying that, if you wanna learn this, here's how I could help you.
And you gave them a reason to learn it.
And I gave them a reason to learn it.
Yeah.
So I wasn't saying that, but the other thing I'll mention is that in a way that reading that I did was a little skewed because she was so young, new to her career. And teachers do gradually learn, even when they're handed prepackaged curricula, they learn how to make it their own. And that's part of the answer to your question too. You know, we learn how to to do what's asked, but also to do it our way in response to the student's way of learning. And so it's just a more responsive, student-centered approach, working within certain parameters. So, I mean, I can't quite address all the aspects of that question, but, yeah. And I do believe some things have to be learned in folks. And, you know, John Dewey always argued that it's not an either-or situation where we have these requirements for teachers, which we do. And as a teacher educator, I can tell you, I went through the extraordinary proliferation of requirements for teachers. But what Dewey was saying is you've got external demands on a student, but you've also got the student's purposes. And you, with thoughtful, intelligent approaches, can bring those together. Yeah.
Well, I think that, the incident of the young woman that you were observing is a good example because, this is one of the, I taught as well. I taught in parochial and private, schools, and then I taught in public school in LA, in San Fernando Valley. So I taught to people who were not, you know, in school because they wanted to go to college, okay? But when you're getting observed as a teacher, and especially a new teacher, that you may be doing stuff that you know, that is against your instinct, but you have to do it because, you know, your administrator may be, you know, less involved than you are, you know, so there's all kinds of barriers as a teacher.
Yes, and that's why I'm saying it isn't the best of examples, because she was so new to it, and
Yeah.
experienced teachers still have these, excuse me, constraints. And what I was also trying to show that I think I didn't read this part is that the experienced teacher in the classroom also stopped because of those constraints. They were dictated their schedule of when to teach what, even if they needed to stay with something in the moment for that student or whatever. She just found the constraints were growing. This was all in response to teaching to the test, standards-based learning, different. Yeah. What do people think? Is that perhaps enough, or do you have a burning question or anything else?
My questions are pretty big.
Oh dear.
So maybe we
Oh, dear.
should just, like have a glass of wine and chat.
Yeah, you
What do
can
you
ask
think?
me over wine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, you could tell them what your questions are.
Okay, alright.
I'm not gonna answer them.
You can, alright, the last one, I won't say all of them. So your career in education began in the 1970s and has culminated some 50 years later in the writing of this book. So I was wondering, not to put you on the spot, but at some point, over dinner or whatever, if you could say a bit about the relationship between the kind of arc of your career and the arc of our culture or our society. So the ways in which it has changed over the past half century. So in other words, if the kind of crisis in public education is a constant throughout your career, I think as you narrate it, throughout that time period, how has the substance of the crisis evolved, its kind of political and social conditions, and also the possibility perhaps of its amelioration or even transcendence? But again, that's such a big question, and maybe coming at the end.
Well, I'll tell you what, I really look forward to talking to you about it over dinner, and I'll just say super briefly here. It changed, the context changed, you know, pendulums swing, trends come and go. The context did change, and I could talk about how and what my response was to some of those. And I'll also say that in the epilogue to the book, where I go back into schools to
Right.
see what has changed, I came out with the conclusion that these abiding ideas abide.
Yeah. So there is a kind of
There's
continuity.
change and there's continuity.
The one thing that I left out of the intro is after retiring from Empire State College, you worked as a sort of instructional assistant in a public high school in Winooski, Vermont. So there's a nice kind of symmetry, or sort of, you know, sort of full circle kind of moment at the end. So you began, of course, in a public high school in Somerville in the 70s, and then ending in one, in a certain sense, in Winooski, Vermont, in, you know, whatever, 10 years ago. So yeah, I really appreciate how the book attends to both these sort of changes and transformation, evolutions in your own thinking, which Jared pointed to, but also that kind of continuity of these key ideas, concepts, philosophies that you're rightly committed to.
And I'll just say, if you want to just read the last 10 pages of this book, it's about that Winooski school. And even in White, Vermont, this was a school that was 55% immigrants, refugees from around the globe. And so it was fascinating to go into that situation, again, a working class, dense town.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.